Hi, everybody. I am Emmanuel Ramos Barajas, and I am the co-curator of this series. I work as the media and communications coordinator at the Block Museum of Art at Northwestern University. I am also the co-producer of Unsettling Journeys, an educational YouTube channel dedicated to deconstructing Latinx identities through art history. I want to welcome everybody to the second conversation of the Borderless Cultures Film Festival. It has been organized by Assistant Professor in American Studies at UNC Chapel Hills, Annette Rodriguez, and myself. And this is our way to gather across space, watch movies, and share time and ideas. And I constantly spend time thinking about the power of images and how they communicate their message. We know popular culture constructs, informs, and reflects our societies. As such, the festival aims to bring together filmmakers and scholars to share films that are otherwise not in wide release. We have selected films that tell us something about the US racialization of Latinx peoples in the United States. And our goal is to reframe Latinx, Latin American, and Mexican histories, and by extension, the interlaced histories of Indigenous, Asian, Black, and Anglo peoples in what today is the South and West of the United States. But before I let Annette deliver her opening remarks, I would like to introduce our guests. Director ALEX RIVERA is a filmmaker who's been telling groundbreaking Latino stories about labor, immigration, and politics for more than 20 years. In 1997, he directed the short film we watched for today's conversation, Why Cybraceros. It was inspired by 1950s US propaganda. The film was the precursor to his first feature film, Sleep Dealer, a cyberpunk that won multiple awards at Sundance and has been screened around the world, where immigrant workers in Tijuana, Mexico, remotely control robots who carry out the labor on the other side of the border. Rivera's second feature film, a documentary scripted hybrid set in an immigration detention center, The Infiltrator, won both the Audience Award and the Innovator Award at the 2019 Sundance Film Festival. Joining him today is Dr. IRENE MATA, an associate professor of women and gender studies at Wellesley College. In her research, Dr. Mata investigates how women of color, especially immigrant women, and their labor are represented in contemporary cultural productions, literature, and pop culture. Her book, Domestic Disturbances, Reimagining Narratives of Gender, Labor, and Immigration, surveys the treatment of the traditional immigrant narrative in popular culture. Her current research continues examining popular culture and how Chicanx and Latinx performance engage with movement of resistance and social activisms. In addition to Alex's short film, Why Cybraceros, we have gathered today to discuss the 1954 Salt of the Earth, directed by Herbert Biberman, which recreated and chronicled the true events of a strike in 1951 to 1952 by the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers against Empire Zinc in New Mexico. Completed against all odds, including the deportation of the main actress to Mexico, the film was denounced as communist propaganda when it was released in 1953. Distributors boycotted it, newspapers and radio stations rejected advertisements for it, and the projectionist union refused to run it. Ultimately, it screened in less than 12 theaters nationwide in 1954. The film highlights the complexity of gender, labor, and family relationships during a hostile political climate. But without getting into too many of the details yet, I want to allow Annette, in her usual eloquent and powerful words, to let us know why we had you watch these films and why we pair them up together. Annette?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Emmanuel. And I really want to thank you all so much for sharing time and space with us. And those of you on the other side of the screen, thank you for inviting ALEX RIVERA's short Why Cybraceros into your home, along with the home spaces and elders that are from my home places. And of course, I want to thank Emmanuel, who brought together ALEX RIVERA and popular culture scholar, Dr. IRENE MATA. Dr. Mata grew up around the corner from me in El Paso, Juarez, in the shadow of three Asarco stacks, at the time the largest smokestacks in the United States, where mining companies refining ore also pumped dangerous metals into the air, the land, the water, contaminating Central El Paso and all the surrounding areas. And so Dr. Mata's expertise in stories of immigration and popular culture offers so much to today's conversation as we work through Salt of the Earth and why Cybraceros, with its filmmaker, which is such a pleasure. So in the opening monologue of Salt of the Earth, Esperanza, and Esperanza means hope, Esperanza explains, quote, "This house is not ours, but the flowers are ours." And thus begins our signal that the film will be expansive about the full lives of Mexican and Mexican American people who are laborers. And the film will reveal the brutality of the company towns where Mexican miners were put into dual wage labor systems, paid less, put in dangerous and deadly conditions in the mines, and also had deductions taken from their paltry pay to pay for their houses, which they were misled by the mining companies to believe they would one day own. Miners would agree to paycheck deductions, believing proudly that they were buying their homes. And only later would those miners and their families, like my grandfather, Isabel Rivera Doñez, find out that after sometimes decades of deductions from their paychecks, at the very best, they may own the house, but not the land on which it stood. And so in 1963, as the mines expanded, my family lost their home, which my grandfather had surrounded with plots of subsistence vegetables, a thriving milpa, hollyhocks of all colors higher than the roof of the house, as my mom and my sisters so beautifully describe. And these Mexican folks learned, as Esperanza explains in the film's opening monologue, the house is not ours, but the flowers are ours. And it's a stunning and mournful beginning to Salt of the Earth. And so as we dig, pun intended, as we dig into this mining community's representation, we're so grateful to have ALEX RIVERA here along with scholar Dr. IRENE MATA. They'll help us think through the aesthetic and artistic choices, the context of the film's production and its persistent relevance. And my brilliant co-curator, Emmanuel, came up with the idea of pairing these two films together. Salt of the Earth with Why Cybraceros, this pointed short you all have had the opportunity through the generosity of ALEX RIVERA to view. This short recreates the short promotional video produced in the 1950s by the California Growers Council to defend their exploitative use of braceros in US agriculture. And so Rivera reimagines this film for our wireless present in his short. And so as we look at the brutality of labor systems in the 1950s and the dystopian futures, as in Why Cybraceros, and later in the award-winning Sleep Dealer, we might return to the echoes and the whispers of the brilliant Toni Morrison. Mm. We might find ourselves reminded of Toni Morrison's Beloved, which comes decades later, when in Esperanza's opening monologue, a pregnant Esperanza, a pregnant hope, explains, quote, "I wish that my child would never be born. No, not into this world," end quote. This world, for instance, where my widely smiling, laughing, and singing Uncle Jesse, again, Paz Descanse, was born into. My Uncle Jesse was born into this world represented in the film. He was born into the very mining town of the film about the time of its production. And he returned after the Vietnam War to the canneries of Kansas and later as a landscaper in Southern California. And the impact of borders that are flexible for labor, as shown in these films, but hostile to the full laughing and singing lives of people, of laborers, is some of what our conversation will take up today. And finally, and most importantly, speaking of full lives, if you all have seen the beautiful graphics done by Emmanuel for this event, you see the women of Salt of the Earth framed by the sheriffs. And so if you've seen those graphics, you've seen Senora Sanchez. She's the fourth from the right. She's fiercely looking straight ahead. And Monday, March 1st, was Senora Sanchez's 105th birthday. Her daughter, Elisa, let us know. So I know you all join me in saying Feliz cumpleaños, Senora Sanchez. Your heroic fight for a better world is remembered and is celebrated. And for every time Las Mañanitas played in our homes, across space and times, as we were watching Salt of the Earth as they sang for Esperanza, I hope that you know that it was playing for you also. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, that was beautiful. I want to remind our audience members that if there's any questions or comments, issues, please let us know in the Q&A box. We will get to them. But before we do, I want to have our guest speak. And when Annette and I were talking about these films, she mentioned something that struck me, which was, you know, as we saw, she's from this area. Her family and her community are entrenched in this story. And this is a story about the triumphs of labor, the triumphs of the plights of labor. And with Salt of the Earth specifically, a lot of the times the context surrounding the film, that of blacklisted and suspected communist directors, always takes the main narrative of the film. So when we talk about the Salt of the Earth, we end up talking a lot about blacklisted, about censorship, about government meddling in this production. And what happens as a result is that the labor often gets erased. You know, the labor that's being represented from the miners and their strike, and a lot of times that gets erased. And what I liked about Alex's short is that it's all about erasing the labor. So before we get into the context of the film and the censorship and the types of stories that grow out of narratives like this, I want to begin by focusing on what Salt of the Earth accomplished. And that is that Salt of the Earth managed to nuance the ethics of the domestic US empire, race, class, gender, and national identity, or what art historian Kirsten Pye Buick calls the tools of hate. So as early as the 1950s, in the supposedly placid post-war period, the film tackles these reigning issues, interrupting the dominant narrative by presenting honest depictions of white allyship with people of color, a rejection of the American dream in favor of basic human rights, and an intersectional feminist challenge to white patriarchy and machismo. Mm-hmm. With such a potent legacy and what this film accomplished, since then, many Latinx representations during the subsequent 70 years have failed to uphold the messages of this film. As scholars of popular media and as content creators, Alex and Irene, why do you think that is?
I think that's a really wonderful question. And I teach Salt of the Earth in my film class, and it's the first film that we watch, because I want students to understand that even in 1954, it was possible to have like a representation of Latinx, Chicanx bodies that's rooted in like an ethic, right, of like actually understanding the community. Because then the next film we watch is the very, very popular West Side Story, right, which undoes absolutely everything that Salt of the Earth does, right? But we have a lot of discussions about like why is it that we have this like gem of a film that really captures the complexities of this community, and how does that get lost in history, right? Because none of my students have watched the film before they get into the class, right? So these stories get lost. And I think it's because the story that the film tells is a very dangerous one, right? It's a story of solidarity, but it's also a story that is calling on a wider and whiter audience to acknowledge, right, this history of oppression of this Mexican American community. I love the way that Annette started talking about, her family and the land, because this story is also about the land, right? It's about the fact that, from the beginning, with the narration of this woman, a female narrator telling a story is radical in 1954, right? But she's also telling the story of loss. She's telling the story of this land that was once theirs. So when you factor in this kind of like history that the film is invoking, right, a history of systemic oppression, when you factor in the solidarity narrative, right, of these Anglo union workers working with the Mexican American workers, when you factor in this critique of patriarchy, right, when you factor in this acknowledgement of the labor that happens in the home as labor. When you factor in like all of these different pieces, it's too much for a Hollywood machine that traffics in stereotype. It's too uncomfortable for an audience to have to be confronted with all of their prejudices and biases, right? So it's very easy to see why we go from Salt of the Earth to something so like ridiculous and harmful, right? Like West Side Story. But those are the types of narratives that people pay money to see, because those are the types of narratives that make people really comfortable with their own biases, their own prejudices, their own ideologies, right? Of the inferiority of people of color and of workers and of women and so forth, right?
Yeah. That's really interesting, yeah, especially considering that someone like Richard Nixon walked out of a screening of West Side Story calling it communist propaganda. So if he could not handle West Side Story, how could he possibly handle Salt of the Earth? Yeah, and I think it's true. It's such an honest, raw film that watching it completely changed my perspective of like, wow, like even in 1950s, comparing it to all of the television shows that were happening at the time, presenting like this hegemonic, perfect white family and, like the mom, the dad, all of that. And then going from that to something as real as this, it must have been quite a shock. Alex, in terms of how you tell your stories, how does a film like this inspire you?
Well, I mean, thank you so much for opening up this space, and thank you, Annette, for your opening comments. And, my partner in life is from El Paso, and it's the filmmaker Cristina Ibarra. And through her, I've gotten to know a whole universe of border scholars from El Paso, from Laredo. So there's so many good minds and good voices kind of coming out of those literal borderlands. And anyway, so it's just great to be here and to share in this dialogue. In terms of, Salt of the Earth is a film that I saw a long time ago. And when I saw it, it is, I think to Irene's point, it's a film that it seems almost unbelievable, like, because it is so radical and confrontational and multidimensional in its critique and in its politics. And it's from the 1950s, an era that, we see the 1950s sort of regurgitated to us as the sort of Leave It to Beaver era. Mm-hmm. And we forget how polyvocal, how complicated, how contradictory the time was, filled with, obviously lots of dynamics, whether in terms of the civil rights movement, Jim Crow, those struggles, those violences, labor, and the issues that are touched on in the film. And so it's an incredible document to both, because it reflects the realities of that time, but also that it reflects the creators of that time and the militant and I do think communists, some of them were accused of being communists and some of them were self-identified communist artists that were visionaries in the film industry, telling some of the most powerful and well-crafted stories. So as a filmmaker, to look at it, you both get inspired by the work, what's inside the frame, but also what is outside the frame, the story of how it came to be, and what it says about the potential of art and art making itself. And in any case, so for me, it was, it was just a sort of shocking film to engage with the first time I saw it. And also, very, very inspiring.
Yeah. And I think that's true about what's happening outside of the frame, what's happening in the context, because with this film particularly, and that's something that Annette and I try to negotiate of saying, like, we don't want to just focus on the context of blacklisting, because ultimately that erases the actual labor, the actual pain and suffering of the people who are being represented in the film. But I think it is important to talk about it, especially because the very same year that this film came out, another film about labor and unions came out, and that is On the Waterfront. And On the Waterfront, directed by Elia Kazan, who not only collaborated with HUAC, the House of Un-American Committees, he actually named names. He ousted his fellow coworkers and, people in the industry and said, these people are communists. And to see just the two extremes of that, you have someone who collaborated with the government to oust people for being communists and people who completely rejected that. And you see that in the types of films that they made. Obviously On the Waterfront is super safe. It won Academy Awards. We celebrate it and we watch it in every American film history class. And Salt of the Earth remains hidden. It remains kind of under the rock. But, I think my next question is precisely about this. As a hyper visible film, in terms of at the time that it was made, not necessarily that many people saw it, but that a lot of people in power knew it was being made and they were worried about it, especially as a film about labor, regulation, and resistance made by suspected communists. The characters' plight often mirrors those faced by the directors and producers during the filming. The meta text and the context of the film, often rich and full of unprecedented firsts, like this is one of the only or the first blacklisted film in US history, overshadowed the revolutionary content, especially effectively erasing Latinx labors. As scholars and content creators, what kind of ethical practices should inform the wide dissemination of narrative like this? In other words, how can creators control the context in order to avoid erasures present in this narrative?
Alex, I think you should go first with this one.
Okay. Well, I think another of the impacts of watching this film, engaging with Salt of the Earth, is it's almost like that Philip Dick novel, The Man in the High Castle. It kind of reminds us of like an alternate reality that could have been. Like if we imagine Salt of the Earth not as an outlier, but as the beginning of a rich Latino cinema of many voices and many makers, engaging with Latino stories, and our reality over this past 70 years. If we imagine that, and then but then wrestle with the fact it didn't happen. Yeah. It didn't happen. We've had an incredibly thin cinematic production, especially within the language of feature films, and especially within the subset of feature films with resources. There's just been an incredible scarcity of production, and intentionally, in my opinion. So your question, Emmanuel, about how do we ethically create work, is the question is kind of like, how do we ethically produce work? How do we ethically tell these narratives? I think it's a complicated question, because we need to have a whole ecosystem of knowledge production. And it starts to me inside the academy, telling our history, having researchers package it in books and classes and educate storytellers so that we know where we're coming from, where we are, what stories to tell. We have to generate our own history. That's the kind of earth or the kind of ground that then artists, socially committed and socially engaged artists, can kind of rise up from that field of knowledge production. Yeah. And then you deal with all kinds of questions about building the capacity for the sort of educated, socially committed class of artists to create work and engage with the economy of film, the political economy of the film industry, and make work that is committed and responsive to the crises and the times we live in. And we're unfortunately, I feel like, kind of at the beginning of that process in a way. We've had certain, some filmmakers have stepped up and brought in their work. I think of, filmmakers to me like Lourdes Portillo, visionary media artists, people at the outer edges of the film system like Guillermo Gomez Peña. Obviously in the center of the film system, filmmakers like Gregory Nava, Luis Valdez. But those kinds of works, the feature films, we can count them on one hand. There's not enough. And so to create a kind of socially committed Latino or Latinx cinema, it's working on multiple fronts simultaneously. And I think it starts with acknowledging that, that the history of the past 70 years, a rich, vital, radical, visionary, well-crafted Latino cinema that could have sort of come out of the salt of the earth moment, was suppressed. It was prevented from happening, and here we are in 2021, in some ways, perhaps in a beginning phase.
Let's be hopeful. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And I think you captured so much of what I was thinking around this question. When I think of Salt of the Earth, and one of the things that it does really well is that it captures this story of this community. And one of the reasons that it captures the story of this community is because Michael Wilson, who wrote the screenplay, actually spent time, right, with the community. He traveled to Grand County, and he had, he attended union meetings. He went to people's homes. He watched the strike unfold. Like he was there and he was listening. And so when he wrote the screenplay, he was also sharing it with the community, right? And the community had feedback, and they were able to push back and say, no, we don't like this storyline. You need to change this. And he did, but which is one of the reasons that the narrative of the story feels so authentic, and not in like this is fake authentic, but like it's their story to tell. And what Wilson does is he allows, he gives up his power to tell that story.
Yeah.
And invites the people who are actually experiencing that life to tell their story through him. Right? There's still power, but he gives up so much of that power. I think that what happened since, and happens all the time in cinema, is that we have these people in power, oftentimes the people who have the resources, trying to tell our stories when they deem our stories worth telling. So I think that one of the biggest problems that we have is that our stories haven't been seen as important enough to tell. Yeah. Right? Our stories are not seen as the stories of the nation. Right? We're marginal. Our lives, our communities, they're not what makes up, right, America. So those stories don't get told because they're not seen as valuable, right? When we start, so if we already have our stories being seen as marginalized and not really important and not really, defining what America is, right, the U.S., then there's no investment in telling those stories. And when they are told, oftentimes, unless they are being told by, people in the community, they become, again, these like stereotypes. They become these, either incredibly harmful representations or these like ineffective, there's so many movies that have come out of Hollywood that are supposed to be about Latinx people, yeah. Right? And I know not so many, like the handful that come out, right? They're supposed to be about Latinx people that end up being just trash. Yeah. But because at the end of the day, like who's in the studio, who's in the room when the script is being written?
Yeah.
Like, who's behind the camera? who is producing it. Right? So it's this whole chain of people who are making decisions about what we're going to watch. And oftentimes, like, their decisions are being informed by their own prejudices. Their decisions are being informed by their need for profit, right? Because Hollywood is a for-profit industry. They're not making films out of the goodness of their heart. They're not making films to like really educate. Big studios make films to make money.
Yeah.
And so our stories aren't seen as valuable.
Yeah.
And I think if I'm just piggybacking off of that really quickly, in terms of the interfacing a little bit with the question of also ethics and just artistic depth, I think these things all line up, because I think an artist can approach the question of ethics as a system of constraints or something like that. But I think that in a lot of ways, kind of ethical storytelling is actually something that can empower and free the artist in a sense. And what I mean by that is this film, like as Irene pointed out, it was not written or directed by the minors. It was not written or directed by Chicanos. It was written and directed by white filmmakers. In today's kind of moment of awakening and reckoning, racial reckoning, this kind of process is being interrogated. And there's a lot of funders right now that don't want to fund right now, just in the past year or two, are starting to make commitments. We don't want to fund a film about Latino story made by a white director, that kind of thing. And we could spend a whole hour talking about these issues, these specific ones. They're complicated. But I think what Irene is pointing out is these storytellers did the work. They listened. And as a Latino artist, I identify as a Latino artist, you still have to listen. It doesn't matter what community you kind of imagine yourself being a part of. You're always only inhabiting a part of it. You're always living a particular experience. And to challenge yourself and to enter the realm of a socially committed or an ethically committed storyteller is to listen. To listen to people unlike you, even within the confines are communities, these so-called communities, the Latinx or Latino community, tens of millions of people there. Is that even a community? We could talk about that. But there's so much variance and disparate knowledge and disparate experience inside that community. So to basically acknowledge how much listening and sort of being rooted in different social processes, getting outside your bubble, what you're born into, the history you're born into, the path you're born into, disrupting that somehow. I think that the filmmakers of Salt of the Earth are inspirational in that sense and that practice, which I think we all benefit from, in which, in the short film that was showed as part of this program was not part of my process. This short film is like a kind of cartoon of sorts, or it's like a little, provocation. But in my later work, especially in Infiltrators and Sleep Dealer, these were works that were steeped in a long process of listening,
Yeah. And I think, you both touched on so many things. And in fact, like three of the questions touched upon three of the questions, so I'll try to pace myself. But I think it's so interesting, yes, because it begins with education, and it begins not only with educating the creators and creating the producers who are in positions of privilege and have to learn to listen not only to their guts and to their friends, but listen to the people that they're trying to depict in these films. And I think in that same way, if those opportunities to learn or to teach, let's say, people of color or minorities and put them in positions of power and positions to produce, I think as a community, what we have to do is imagine new modes of telling our stories outside this very strict industry, modes or methods or formats, and really craft a new industry, because what we're seeing with this film particularly is Salt of the Earth is well known, it is inspirational, but at the same time, sometimes this knowledge doesn't go outside the bounds of the institution that is academia, so it doesn't go outside of the bounds that is academia. It doesn't enter the bounds of the institution that is the film industry. And what we get is just, as Irene said, trash representation. And it's in a way very sad, but it reminds me precisely of the biopic that was made about this film, which was called One of the Hollywood 10. So this is a Spanish and British production where, in trying to tell the story and trying to honor the making of this film and the plight of the cast and crew, the directors and producers of this biopic, One of the Hollywood 10, essentially make a film where the white characters are the only protagonists. And the Mexican-American characters on whom Salt of the Earth is based and who did the actual labor and struggle to have their voices heard are depicted as unimportant, literal extras. And it reminds me of something that Sharon Holland wrote. She is in the UNC Chapel Hill American Studies Department with Annette. She's one of her colleagues. Essentially, they occupy space. They occupy nothing more than space. They don't have any world-making capacities. And in this way, it shows us the traps of representation and how being represented and being hyper-visible in the media can be just damaging, because in the best of cases, minorities are depicted as having achieved the American dream with all the capitalist consuming that entails, or in the worst of cases, we are depicted as minor characters with no world-making effects. Even in movies about the border, about immigration, it usually is just white savior tropes, So in an era that holds representation as the basis of success, how do we ensure that we make ethical content? Going back to this, it's like content that properly represents people of color, but that does not lend itself to be appropriated by the entertainment industry merely to capitalize from the audiences that are being represented.
And if I might, I'd love it if Irene told us more about the way in which she's looking at kind of alternate storytelling narratives, et cetera, right? And other kinds of creative endeavors within the community that I think, that's a piece of it too.
So I think that the question of having our work appropriated is a really complicated one, right? Because I think that if there's one thing we've seen is that if anything is slightly successful, right, corporations will jump on it because they want to sell it. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's much more complicated because we can't control how our materials are used, right? Like once a film, once a song, once a book is published, is written, is out there in the world, then we have no control on how it's consumed, right? I think that the best that we can ask content creators to do is, again, come from a place of like an ethics of like responsible representation. And it's a complicated process, right? As Alex kind of also, talked about and points out. I think the larger question about like, how do we interrogate or how do we make these interventions? There's resources there, but they're so minor. And I think one of the things that I end up my class with, so we start off with Salt of the Earth, and then we watch a bunch of other films, and most of them are independent films, right? A few of them are studio films, because again, the studio films are not being made for us. But I always end with Aurora Guerrero's Mosquita y Mari, because for me, that's like such a beautiful example of like, how is it possible for us to create our own stories, right, that don't have the limitations of studios, being like the limitations that the studios impose on our storytelling, right? And so what she did with Mosquita y Mari is she like raised funds from the community. Like that's how Mosquita y Mari comes to be, right? And I do think that we now have these different channels that we didn't necessarily have before. Before, you could only make a film if you had these huge amount of resources, right? But now film has become more democratized, right? At least some of the processes are. And what makes Mosquite, I mean, and a lot of people didn't watch Mosquite Mari, but those of us who have watched Mosquite Mari, right, walked away feeling a sense of so much pride and accomplishment, knowing that this was a little film that it so beautifully captured this story of these two young women. And that it's such a stunning and glorious film. I love this film. And yes, maybe a lot of people didn't see it, but those of us who did watch it, those of us who have helped support it, there's, that gives, for me, as someone who teaches film, that gives me hope, right? So that Alex, when The Infiltrators comes out and we can teach it in our classrooms, we can have like another, right? So that when my students leave the classroom, they don't leave hopeless anymore. They leave thinking, you know what, this is a possibility of film. Like, this is why film is important, right? This is why we need to support independent filmmakers. This is why we need to be involved in independent filmmaking, because there is, right, the possibility to make these important interventions. And again, we can't control how our work is co-opted. Like it's a giant machine, right? And we get fed into it. But, like Alex and Aurora and all of these other like incredible filmmakers have shown us that there is a way of controlling the messaging of the film.
Well, Aurora has been a friend and comrade for many years, and her film, if folks on the conference have not seen Mosquita y Mari, absolutely check it out. It is an example of the cinema we deserve. But and I think you're raising so many questions. I mean, one is about the method to build an independent Latino cinema, the relationship to capitalism in terms of producing these kinds of works, in terms of distributing them. I would also take a step back and just say that kind of, to me, the challenge fundamentally creatively is speaking against sort of internal colonization, that we are a community that has been colonized in many ways, and to create an authentic, a deep, a dignified Latino cinema is to confront that. And there's many minefields in doing that. And it's problematic and it's challenging in so many ways. One of those ways is that the first person who speaks is always going to be partial. There's whatever you say is never enough.
Right.
Because the depth of our community's experience, the history that we've lived that's been untold, it's so vast. And if you start to put it in a film, it's always never enough. And what we really need is, we need many films. We need a polyvocal movement. And I just personally draw so much inspiration from the Black community and the way that they've faced these challenges. And obviously there's ways in which that community overlaps with the Latino community. I don't mean to reinscribe a separation or erase Afro-Latino, but just to speak broadly about these two communities. 40 years ago, over 40 years ago, Roots is on TV. Over 40 years ago, The Cosby Show is on TV. Now, both of them partial and, fraught in different ways, but it's that kind of stretching out of space of possibility to speak. And no one work should be expected to be perfect, but they all kind of wrestle with pieces of the conundrum of being colonized in America and trying to exist here and be here. And that's what we need. The community that we imagine we're a part of, the Latino, Latinx, this thing that we don't even know what to call it, is so big. And so we just need many representations. And for me, one thing specifically that I've been enjoying in my work is trying to find those kind of currents in American pop culture that are deep around, for example, the underdog. This is like, so many, countless films. I mean, very, very few films, maybe like Top Gun or, films that ask you directly to identify with the conqueror. You're almost always inside of white cinema asked to identify with a kind of underdog, So in Infiltrators, it was very fun to take the kind of the form, the kind of habit, the genre of identifying with the underdog and sort of fuse that to an undocumented activist going up against the system. David and Goliath, we root for David. But so is there ways to take our community's journey and not do a kind of poverty porn looking at suffering? Oh, let's look at this horrible suffering. Obviously not do the right-wing thing. This is a community of criminals, but do the thing of a community of underdogs fighting back against all odds and create Latino characters that are in motion. And obviously, I think Salt of the Earth, to return there, was doing this so long ago, and so I think in some ways the pathways are clear. America is many things, but it is a place that does celebrate the underdog, celebrates the fight against all odds. I think there are ways to tell true and good and deep Latino stories that hijack the culture, that play with it and open up space for us to imagine ourselves, and again, I think the African American community has shown us some of the ways that can be done.
I wonder too if you, Alex, and you, Irene, as well, want to tell us more about the Infiltrators, which is now like its 1 year birthday, right? And so I know that we all haven't gotten the chance to see it in wide release, but it's certainly something that for those of us who've seen Sleep Dealer, who now got this like cool little short, which to me is so like, I love the animation in Why Cybraceros, and there's this moment that's sort of comical, but it's really potent, where you see two braceros moving alone without the body, right? And it's like, oh, that's what we're talking about with, and that's the critique, embedded in this little visual moment. But I wonder if you can tell us more about the Infiltrators, and also, Irene, your interest in it. I know you had talked about, as someone who brings film to your students, that was one you were really excited about.
It was. Unfortunately, the pandemic happened, and so I hope at some point we'll be able to reschedule that screening. But I haven't actually had the privilege of watching The Infiltrators. Like that's one of the problems, right? That sometimes these films, I mean, I've known about it, I've been hearing about it. I wanted to go to screenings that were happening like in other states that are close by, but it just like had never happened. So even though I know that this film is amazing, because I do have colleagues at other institutions who have seen it, like I haven't had access to that film, right? And that's why I was so excited about bringing it to Wellesley, which we will still do. We'll still figure out how to do that. But so I'm really excited to hear about Alex about this film.
Yeah. Well, for me, I mean, for my whole, my career, I started making films in 1994, and my father is from Peru. He came to the United States in his early 20s, and I in the mid 1990s, when I was kind of looking around and I was in college and trying to figure out where my compass would point, what I would do, and decided that I wanted to work with this medium of pictures and sound. And in the mid 1990s, there was so many things going on. The border wall was going up, Prop 187 in California. There were vigilantes on the border. NAFTA was being implemented. The Zapatistas were rising up, calling for a globalization from below. It was a sort of hot moment, and to think about immigration. And so I decided to kind of make some films about immigration. And I started with my dad's story, but all the way along, as I started to do this work, obviously that moment in 1994, which felt like a kind of fever pitch, it felt very hot, very rife with a lot of conflict, racial conflict, social conflict, was not the peak of the mountain. It was the beginning of a long march. The border wall got bigger, the detention centers sprouting. And so in around 2010, I was thinking, like, because I've been watching the system, the immigration enforcement system, kind of grow and fossilize and just become bigger and deeper and embedded in our society. I was wondering who would ever stop it, because I have undocumented folks in my family. They were very much like lay low. And so I was wondering who would stop this process. And the Dreamers stepped onto the stage around 2010, 2011. And I was fascinated specifically by the radical Dreamers who were doing civil disobedience. They were getting themselves arrested and really forcing the Obama administration to make a choice of either take some executive action to protect them or deport them. And these actions were radical. So The Infiltrators tells the story of that group, a group of radical Dreamers who were out to stop deportations. It's a true story. And they go into a detention center. That's the infiltrating. They get apprehended by Border Patrol on purpose to go into the detention center to try to stop deportations in detention. And I'd been filming with this group for about a year and a half by the time they did this action. And then we used the language of fiction, of actors, a set, all of that to recreate what happened in detention where our documentary camera could not go. But we use a documentary camera to depict what happened outside detention, the planning, the support team. People kind of go in and out of the detention center. And so they turn from like their real selves in front of the documentary. They get turned into an actor and go into detention and then come back out again. And so it was just like I mentioned earlier, in one sense, it was like, it's a heist film. It's like breaking into jail to get people out of jail. It's like the Ocean's 11 of immigration. But it was also because the visual challenges of detention were so strange that we had to kind of make a formally experimental film. And so, so that's The Infiltrators. I put in the chat a link. You can also get it. You can get it on this website. You can also get it on Jeff Bezos's website. It's out there.
Yeah, and I think that the great thing about that is not just a tragedy. It's what you're saying. It's that underdog breaking in and effing things up. We're essentially out of time, but I really wanted to ask about future possibilities. You mentioned this with imagining a legacy that never happened, with Salt of the Earth. This could have been the beginning of a movement or the beginning of something, and it was snuffed out, And so in that way, I really feel this kinship to science fiction. Science fiction is very, very Western heavy, but when you start imagining science fiction in alternative worlds, especially with Afrofuturism, that doesn't have to rely just in like Europe and science, I want to know, what about creating alternate worlds and possibilities make this genre such an attractive atmosphere to work with? What possibilities does the genre offer? And knowing its drawbacks, primarily cost, what workaround have you found to get the content finished?
I love science fiction, which is also why I love The Sleep Dealer. I love science fiction. I think science fiction allows us the possibilities of imagining a world that we don't live in, right? Mm-hmm. I see the ways in which science fiction also functions with activism, right? And this idea that in order to be activists, in order to work towards a better world, we have to really have like an imagination to see the possibilities that don't seem real in the moment. And science fiction, allows us to imagine these worlds where social justice is a reality, right? When we're no longer confined by like the structures of oppression, right, that we inhabit like every single day, right? Science fiction doesn't have those limitations that are like, oh, this is what's real, this is what's not real, right? And it really challenges what reality is. Do we have to inhabit like this reality in the same ways? And with science fiction, right, we not only can we imagine the possibilities of a world that we want to see, that we want to live in, but science fiction also helps us imagine the dangers of not changing the world in which we're living in, right? And that's one of the reasons that I really enjoyed Cybraceros, why Cybraceros, and why I love Sleep Dealer, right? It's like, for me, these are cautionary tales of if we don't change the ways in which we treat each other, if we don't change the ways we treat human beings, like, is this where we're going to end up? And yes, it might be like this little tiny short with like the funny graphics or the arms falling off, right? That are so like tongue in cheek. But like, are we going to get to the point where we completely strip workers of their humanity, which is something that's been happening for so long? But is it going to get to that point where workers are no longer seen as human at all, right? So for me, science fiction has so many possibilities. But again, I appreciate science fiction from a place where I just enjoy it. I'm not producing it, so I can't even imagine like how much more difficult it is to try to imagine these worlds and make them concrete in film, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much. And that's, you spoke about sort of two realms of possibility of speculative fiction and science fiction. One is its ability to allow us to believe other worlds are possible, to prototype other worlds. That in the tradition of sort of utopian fiction, in terms of thinking about better worlds, for just to simplify it, that's a small body of things, and I'm really interested in that, because I think we need that. We need to pivot towards imagining ways out, because I think the work of creating consciousness around the shortcomings of the world we live in, the violence of the world we live in, a lot of that work has been done. So the hard part is sort of imagining the better world. And there's not a lot of science fiction films that do that imagine better worlds, because the dramatic structure of the science fiction narrative is typically character in conflict with the world. So you think of like Neo waking up in the Matrix. He's not like, oh, wow, it's great to be in a pod having my energy harvested. I'm getting like, no, he wants to escape, But anyways, in countless science fictions, it's always in Sleep Dealer. It's the character, having a dream that turns out to be a nightmare, And so you're always, when you're writing science fiction, you're putting your character into conflict with an imagined world. So they're not usually utopias. They're more often than not dystopias. And there's a huge body of that kind of fiction, which you spoke to, Irene, in terms of science fiction that exaggerates the social conditions we live in, and tries to take impulses, in the case of Sleep Dealer and Why Cybraceros, taking impulses that we live with that seem natural in the moment that we're living, but by exaggerating them, you make them ugly, you make them strange, and when they really should be thought of strange, And so Why Cybraceros is looking, basically at the alienation, what Marx is talking about, the alienation of labor, the fact of a human putting their life energy into an object and being undercompensated. That's how capitalism works. They put in their labor, and they're paid less than what their labor is worth. And that's the profit circuit and the mode of alienation. And so, and we were born in it. We grow up in it. We think it's normal. We accept it every day, but it is ugly and it's weird and it's unjust. And so Sleep Dealer is a project ultimately about exaggerating that into the digital realm where labor can be transmitted and transmuted across distance and embodied in these robots, and you can see the ugliness of the alienation through the exaggeration. But Emmanuel, other than those few thoughts, in terms of making cost-effective science fiction, I would say that, again, sort of post-colonial or decolonial science fiction, Sleep Dealer, as an example of it, says, you don't need to, because of the thematics, because of the modalities of capitalism that our communities are confronting, you're not having to imagine flying cars and shining skyscrapers and a hugely transformed visual world, which is expensive to produce. In Sleep Dealer, I imagined a kind of capillary transformation of the economy, and therefore a kind of capillary transformation of the visual realm, where there's just new little technologies that get into the body, that pull the energy out, little transformations that are big ideas, and so that's how you can do the kind of low budget, high concept thing, guided by, critical and real thinking about our lived experiences, and so I think there is a cinema that can be developed there. I think it's one of the many projects inside the broader project of onlining a robust Latino cinema. But the last thing I wanted to respond to was your prompt around what was it? Oh, what's next? I'm working on a science fiction. So and talk about and I got my first Hollywood writing job, and I've been hired by a company that is that owns the rights to a masked man, a masked avenger of the borderlands. There's not that many of them. You might be able to guess which one, but they're interested in rebooting this character with a sort of science fiction twist. And so I'm on my second draft now of a screenplay, taking this kind of classic Latino-ish masked avenger, but rebooting him as an undocumented hacker whose family gets sort of caught up by ICE, and he starts to go on a kind of vigilante hacking mission against ICE and uncovers a kind of conspiracy of immigration enforcement working in collusion with big data, kind of for-profit data systems colluding with immigration enforcement, and he becomes this kind of masked avenger against all of that stuff. So in any case, that's what I'm working on right now, and it's been really interesting. I've been in dialogue with some of the activists that are doing campaigns like No Tech for ICE, that are detailing how Silicon Valley and these companies that again have the "Don't be evil" type of slogan and the cute, colorful logos are on the back end gathering all of this information and handing it over to immigration enforcement. So working with the real world activists, doing my listening, but then writing inside this like pop cultural project, which would be my first chance to make a movie with some serious resources. So anyways, that's what I'm up to.
Well, this is very exciting. It'll be the first stop, once the world opens up with the large popcorn and the 32-ounce soft drink. That is such an exciting project. I'm thrilled for it. That's wonderful. Yeah. That's really wonderful. In our chat and our Q&A, folks have been asking us if we'll give a list of all of the films everyone has mentioned. From this, learned panel. So just so you all know, there will be a recording of our discussion available where you registered, and we'll send you all a link once that's up. But we will also have a syllabus available, a really beautiful stylized syllabus done by Manuel, where we put some of these resources together so they're more easy for you all to find and to continue this exploration into just tremendously important, rich narratives.
Yeah. I just want to say the world building and the science fiction aspect. I love the scene in Sleep Dealer where you have the elderly people dancing reggaeton. That's the world building at its finest. And so, we have a list of film. We'll have that in the description of the video. Also, Aurora's film is available to stream on Amazon Prime, but not to give more power to the empire. It is also available on Canopy, which you can get to it through libraries and universities. Thank you so much for this wonderful hour. It seems like it was way too short. But thank you so much for joining us. I want to ask you if there's anything else that you would like to promote, your social, your works or websites. Let us know now, and then we can also link it.
I don't have anything, but I will promote one thing that we didn't talk about, which I was really hoping we were going to get to, but that's okay. And that's La Santa Cecilia's Hielo, Ice, the video that Alex directed. That to me is like one of the most like beautiful combinations of music, lyrics, and visuals. So if you haven't seen that music video, you need to watch it. It's stunning.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I'll really quickly, it's a kind of a big one, but I'll do real quick, is after The Infiltrators was released, one of the people featured in the film was targeted by ICE, was detained and deported in apparent retaliation for participating in the film. It's kind of a long story, but now with this new administration, we're kind of, that happened to him about 2 years ago, right after the film premiered at Sundance. And so now with the new administration, we're kind of rebooting the campaign to bring him back. His name is Claudio Rojas, but also to push the Biden administration to stop ICE from doing retribution on other immigrants who speak out. What happened to Claudio from our film is part of a pattern of ICE, long running, but really particularly under Trump, targeting outspoken immigrants. And there's activists have identified, actually lawyers at NYU have identified over 1,200 cases of immigrants who were targeted by ICE for speaking out. And so our petition calls for Biden to stop that practice and to bring them back, to undo the damage and undo the chilling effect that this type of retribution was intended to create. Actually, I don't know if the story of the deportation around Salt of the Earth was in any way sort of a story of retribution, or if it was.
Yeah, she was deported because her passport hadn't been stamped at the border. Okay. And the Mexican Actors Guild got involved, and then they said that they wouldn't allow any Hollywood actors to work in Mexico, but then nothing happened. She got deported, and then she was blacklisted in Mexico as well as the United States.
Wow. Well, there you go. It's ongoing. So this, I just put in the chat the link to our petition. And if folks feel like signing, that's great. And we'll be keeping in touch with as the campaign unfolds. But thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
And we'll make sure that link is also on the site, on the site that has the films for today. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Just two more things. I want to remind everybody that the films will be available to watch and rewatch on our Vimeo account. Salt of the Earth continues to be in the public domain, so it will be available to watch for a long time. Additionally, we have scheduled our third conversation for Wednesday, April 21st, featuring the work and scholarship of Beverly Singer, who is a director and an associate professor of anthropology and Native American studies at UNM, New Mexico, as well as that of John J. Leanos, a new media artist and also a professor of film and digital media at the University of California, Santa Cruz. So join us in a month and a half for another great conversation. And thank you so much, Irene, and thank you so much, Alex, for your time, flexibility, and for sharing your work and scholarship.
Thank you all so much. Good night.
Good night.
Hi, everybody.